History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. That's the old saying, right? The comforting idea that while we face similar challenges across generations, we're not doomed to make the same mistakes forever. Human progress, learning from the past, all that good stuff. But what if I told you that when you dig through the archaeological layers of modern history, when you actually plot out the dates of America's major existential crises, you get something way more unsettling than a rhyme scheme. You get an actual pattern, a cycle so consistent that it looks less like poetry and more like a metronome. 1861, American Civil War. 80 years later, 1941, World War II. 80 years after that brings us to 2021. And yeah, we didn't have a world war start that year, but we did have an attempted coup at the Capitol, the most polarized politics since the Civil War, and the creeping sense that something fundamental might be breaking. So what is going on here? Is this just cherry-picking dates to make a spooky pattern? Or is there actually something to this 80-year cycle theory that keeps popping up in discussions about when the next major conflict might erupt? So let's excavate this properly. We're going to dig into 4 key questions. First, what exactly is this 80-year cycle theory, and where does it come from? Second, when you actually look at the historical evidence across multiple civilizations, not just America, does this pattern hold up or fall apart? Third, if there is a pattern, what's the mechanism? Why would human societies operate on a generational clock? And fourth, what does this mean for us right now, living in the supposed danger zone of the 2020s? I know this is already sounding either conspiratorial or alarmist, so let me be clear up front. This video isn't about predicting World War III or telling you to build a bunker. It's about understanding whether there are actual systemic patterns in how civilizations handle crisis and conflict across generations. And more importantly, understanding why those patterns might exist, and what we can do about them if they do. Cool. So let's start with the theory itself. The most influential version of this cyclical theory comes from William Strauss and Neil Howe, who published The Fourth Turning back in 1997. Their framework is actually more sophisticated than just wars happen every 80 years. They argue that history moves in 4-generation cycles, each lasting about 20 to 25 years. Here's the basic structure. The first turning is the high, a period of strong institutions and consensus, but weak individualism. Think post-World War II America. Suburbs, conformity, everybody trusting the government. The second turning is the awakening. Institutions get questioned, individualism rises, spirituality and culture rebel against the established order. The 1960s and 70s counterculture movements fit here perfectly. The third turning is the unraveling. Institutions are weak, individualism is strong, culture fragments, polarization increases. The 1980s through early 2000s, with rising inequality and declining trust in institutions. And the fourth turning is the crisis, when all that institutional decay and social fragmentation reaches a breaking point, and society either transforms through conflict or collapses. This is your Civil War, your Great Depression, your World War II. According to Strauss and Howe, we entered the fourth turning sometime around 2008 with the financial crisis, which means we're due for a major crisis period lasting into the 2030s. Now, before you roll your eyes at this generational astrology, it's worth noting that this framework has some actual archaeological support when you dig through American history. Let's excavate the evidence. 1781 to 1794. American Revolution concludes. Constitution ratified. Crisis turning. 1860 to 1865. Civil War. Crisis turning. That's 79 to 84 years after the previous crisis. 1929 to 1945. Great Depression and World War II. Crisis turning. That's 64 to 80 years after the Civil War started. 84 years from the constitutional crisis. 2008 to question mark. Financial crisis, COVID, January 6th. Whatever comes next. If the pattern holds, this crisis period should run through the 2020s and possibly into the early 2030s. The average span between these major crises? Right around 80 years, which happens to be roughly 4 generations of 20 years each. And here's what makes this more than just American pattern recognition. When you look at the actual mechanism Strauss and Howe propose, it's not mystical. It's about institutional memory and generational replacement. So why would this cycle exist? Let's think through the logic. Imagine it's 1945. World War II just ended. If you're 20 years old, you either fought in that war or lived through it on the home front. The lessons are visceral. War is hell. Nationalism can be poison. Institutions matter. International cooperation saves lives. You don't need anyone to explain why fascism is bad. You shot at fascists. You don't need a lecture on the importance of strong alliances. Weak alliances just allowed 70 million people to die. Now, fast forward 40 years to 1985. You're 60 years old, at the peak of your career, maybe running a major institution or company. The people you're managing, the young folks in their 20s, they were born in 1965. They have zero lived memory of World War II. To them, the post-war order is just how things are. Boring, established, maybe even oppressive. They're ready to experiment, to tear things down, to question authority. Fast forward another 40 years to 2025. You're 100 years old or dead. The entire institutional memory of World War II exists only in books and documentaries, not in the lived experience of anyone with power. The generation now in their 60s, the ones born in 1965, have no visceral memory of existential war. The generation in their 20s? 3 full generations removed from the last crisis. And that's when things get dangerous. This isn't just theoretical. When you excavate Roman history, you see similar patterns. The Roman Republic had a cycle of crisis roughly every 80 to 100 years. 509 BC, overthrow of monarchy, republic founded. 390 BC, Gauls sack Rome, existential crisis. 119 years later, 264 to 241. BC, First Punic War begins, survival threatened. 126 years later. 133 BC, Gracchi reforms and start of Republic's death spiral. 131 years later. 49. BC, Caesar crosses Rubicon, Civil War begins. 84 years later. The pattern isn't perfect, but here's what's consistent. Whenever Rome went 80 to 100 years without an existential crisis, the institutional safeguards that had been built in response to the last crisis had decayed. The generation that built those safeguards was dead. The generation that remembered why they were built was dying. And the new generation said, "These old rules are stupid and oppressive," and tore them down, which usually preceded the next crisis. There's also an economic archaeology angle here that Strauss and Howe don't fully emphasize, but which reinforces the pattern. Debt cycles. Ray Dalio, the hedge fund manager who's become the YouTube philosopher king of long-term debt cycles, argues there's a 75 to 100-year long-term debt cycle that roughly corresponds to these crisis periods. Here's the mechanism. After a major crisis, a war, a depression, debt levels are either wiped out or brought under control. The generation that lived through that crisis is terrified of debt. They save, they're cautious, they maintain sound money and balanced budgets. But as that generation ages and dies, the new generation never experience the crisis. They think debt isn't scary, debt is just a tool. They borrow more. Institutions loosen standards. Leverage increases. For decades this works. You get the great unraveling period of apparent prosperity. Until the debt reaches unsustainable levels, the bubble pops, and you get your next crisis, which resets the debt cycle and the generational memory simultaneously. When you excavate the data, U.S. debt to GDP was 121% at the end of World War II. It fell to 31% by 1981 as that crisis generation maintained discipline. It's back up to 123% today as we approach the next potential crisis. The cycle isn't just generational memory of conflict. It's generational memory of economic collapse. Now, before this starts sounding too deterministic, and I can already hear the comments firing up, let's talk about why this theory might be completely wrong. First criticism: this is just cherry-picking dates to fit a pattern. If you choose different starting points or include different conflicts, the cycle falls apart. What about World War I? That was only 49 years after the Civil War ended, not 80. What about the War of 1812? That doesn't fit neatly into the framework. If you go back to ancient history beyond Rome, trying to find consistent 80-year crisis cycles becomes nearly impossible because most civilizations faced near-constant warfare. Fair point. The theory works better for the American case than it does for most of human history, which is suspicious. Second criticism: the mechanism is too vague. Generational memory fades explains a lot of things. Why 80 years specifically? Why not 60 or 100? Human lifespans vary. Cultural transmission varies. Some societies maintain institutional memory through strong educational systems or cultural practices that could extend well beyond 80 years. And this matters because if the mechanism isn't precise, then the cycle isn't predictive, it's just descriptive after the fact. Third criticism: this theory was literally designed to make predictions, and it's already failed. Strauss and Howe predicted in 1997 that the fourth turning crisis would climax around 2025. Well, we're here. Where's the World War III they implied was coming? You could argue that COVID, January 6th, and the Ukraine war count as crisis events, but they're nowhere near the scale of World War II or the Civil War. If the theory requires us to retroactively redefine what counts as a crisis, that's a problem. Fourth criticism: human agency and modern institutions might break the cycle. We have nuclear weapons now, which make great power wars unthinkable in ways that weren't true in 1941. We have international institutions, however flawed, that didn't exist before. We have instant communication and historical knowledge available to everyone, not just scholars. Maybe we've learned. Maybe the cycle can be broken by consciousness of the cycle itself. When you excavate beyond just American history, the pattern gets messier. Britain. The English Civil War was 1642 to 1651. The next major existential crisis was the Glorious Revolution in 1688. That's only 37 years. Or do we wait until the American Revolution threatened the empire in 1776, which is 125 years later? China. The Qing dynasty had the Taiping Rebellion, 1850 to 1864. Then the Boxer Rebellion, 1899 to 1901, only 35 to 49 years later. Then the fall of the dynasty and warlord period, 1911 to 1928. Then Japanese invasion, 1937. Then Civil War victory for communists, 1949. That's basically non-stop crisis for a century, not neat 80-year cycles. France. Revolution in 1789. Napoleon's defeat in 1815, 26 years later. Revolution of 1848, 33 years later. Franco-Prussian War and Paris Commune, 1870 to 1871, 22 years later. World War I, 1914, 43 years later. Not exactly a consistent cycle. So the pattern is way cleaner for America than for most other civilizations, which suggests it might be more about American-specific factors, geography, institutions, immigration patterns, than a universal law of history. So where does that leave us? If you take the theory seriously, and I know we've just spent several minutes explaining why maybe we shouldn't, we're living through the fourth turning right now. The crisis period that started around 2008 and should climax sometime in the 2020s or early 2030s. Let's look at what's happened just in the last 15 years. 2008. Financial system nearly collapses. 2016. Brexit, Trump election, populism surges globally. 2020. Global pandemic, worst economic shock since Great Depression. 2021. Attempted coup at U.S. Capitol, democracy itself questioned. 2022. Largest European land war since 1945. 2023 to 24. Multiple regional conflicts, U.S.-China tensions escalating, global debt at record highs, climate disasters accelerating. You could argue we're already in the crisis. It just doesn't look exactly like World War II because, well, we have nuclear weapons and a more interconnected global economy. The crisis manifests as institutional collapse, political polarization, economic fragmentation, and multiple smaller conflicts rather than one massive great power war. Or maybe this is just normal historical turbulence, and we're pattern matching too hard. Here's what I think is actually valuable about this theory, even if the precise 80-year timing is wrong. The core mechanism, that institutional memory fades, that societies forget the lessons of previous crises, that each generation has to learn painful truths for themselves. That's real. When you excavate the evidence, it's undeniable that 1. The people running institutions today have no lived memory of World War II, and only the oldest among them have childhood memories of Vietnam or the 1970s economic crises. For most people under 50, crisis means recession, not existential war or societal collapse. 2. Trust in institutions is at historic lows across most democracies. Whether that's Congress, 20% approval, media, 30% trust, or major corporations, the institutional consensus that defined the post-war period has shattered. 3. The debt levels, inequality levels, and political polarization levels are all approaching or exceeding levels last seen during previous crisis periods. That's not prophecy, that's just measurement. 4. The generation that built the post-war order, that experienced fascism, total war, and the Depression, is functionally extinct in terms of institutional power. The generation that remembered their parents' warnings about those dangers is retiring. And the generations now coming into power think it can't happen here, or the old rules don't apply anymore. Which is exactly what people thought in 1855, 15 years before a civil war that killed 2% of the American population. And exactly what people thought in 1925, 4 years before a depression and 14 years before a world war. So, can we break the cycle? Strauss and Howe would argue no. The cycle is driven by human nature and generational replacement, which are constants. The crisis will come, we'll navigate it or not, and then we'll build new institutions that the next generation will eventually tear down. But maybe there's a third option. The cycle continues, but we make it less deadly. Here's what I mean. Maybe we can't prevent institutional decay or generational memory loss, or debt accumulation, those might be inevitable features of human societies. But we can build in circuit breakers. Nuclear weapons are a morbid example of a successful circuit breaker. They made great power wars so catastrophically dangerous that we've avoided them for 80 years, despite numerous close calls. What are the other circuit breakers? International institutions that make conflict more costly. Transparent communication systems that make propaganda harder. Economic interdependence that raises the price of war. Constitutional mechanisms that slow down authoritarian power grabs. Financial regulations that prevent debt spirals from reaching 1929 levels. None of these prevent the cycle, but they might dampen the amplitude of the crisis when it comes. So, after excavating all this evidence, what's the verdict? Is the 80-year cycle real? Probably not as a hard and fast law of history. The pattern is cleaner for American history than for most other civilizations. The timing is imprecise, and making predictions based on it has already failed at least once. But is there something to the underlying mechanism? The idea that institutional memory fades over time? That each generation has to relearn painful truths? That societies cycle between order and chaos across roughly generational timescales? Yeah, that seems solid. And are we living through a period that has many of the characteristics of previous crisis periods? Institutional decay, political polarization, unsustainable debt levels, generational replacement of the crisis-experienced leadership? Also, yeah. Does that mean World War III is inevitable in the 2030s? No. History isn't a metronome, and human agency matters. The fact that we're even having this conversation, that we can look at these patterns and consciously try to avoid the worst outcomes, might be the very thing that breaks the cycle, or at least bends it. But it would be foolish to assume that just because we know about the pattern, we're automatically immune to it. Every generation that walked into a crisis period probably thought they were too smart, too advanced, too enlightened to repeat the mistakes of the past. They weren't. The question is whether we are. If you found this deep dive into historical patterns and generational cycles interesting, probably smash that like button, because this video is going to anger both the everything is fine crowd and the prepper apocalypse crowd simultaneously, and I'm going to need all the help I can get. Let me know in the comments. Do you think we're living through a fourth turning crisis right now? Or is this just normal historical turbulence that we're overinterpreting? And more importantly, what circuit breakers do you think might help us navigate the next decade without a catastrophic conflict? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one, assuming we make it through the 2020s intact.